As much of American life has come to a halt, the American dairy cow has not. But with demand dwindling, dairy farmers have been led to dump their milk.
It's such a waste, and it's such a trauma for the dairy farmer that has worked so hard.
Ohio farmer Dan Bassey fears the financial losses will be too much for many fellow farmers to sustain.
We fear that we'll be losing more dairy farmers without nearby assistance in the coming year.
Restaurants, ice cream shops, and schools have closed.
30% of the national supply of dairy products goes to food service.
That is dairy farmer Steve Maddox. He has 3,000 dairy cows in Riverdale, California. We first met Maddox in 2018.
You've got to harvest every day, and you got to do something with it.
Farmers like him had already faced drops in dairy prices by roughly 40% over the last several years because of overproduction and an increase in milk alternatives. But now, a crash in the market in just the last week.
The fear of the unknown has crashed the price by almost a third of where it was at. And so that's a little distressful.
Sisters Sydney Brooks and Zoe Nelson are sixth-generation family dairy farmers and sell 100% of their milk to a local Wisconsin cheese company.
You can't shut down cows. You can't turn them off like a faucet.
But now, with a drop in the demand for cheese,
to see it literally going down the drain it's devastating.
Uncertainty at a time in which the future of the American dairy industry already faces serious questions.
So they're looking at substantial losses today, which is why the dairy farmer, after years of struggles, is so upside down in terms of his balance sheet.
Farmers going into debt, many into bankruptcy. Last year alone, nearly 1,000 dairy farmers halted production. For the 42,000 dairy farms that remain, it's about making it to the summer and past the coronavirus.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.